Good evening, everyone. Welcome to everybody joining us here at 1154 Boylston, as well as the hundreds of you online. I'm Catherine Allgore, the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I am delighted that you have chosen to spend the next hour with us for a conversation about the impact of the Italian community on Boston. At the MHS, we are committed to bringing people together with interesting and thought-provoking programs. We host a variety of events that delve into the complexities of our shared history. We are also committed to the preservation of the collective history of the people of Massachusetts and the nation. So this is the part where I'm shilling for the MHS. If you have papers or organizational records that you would like preserved and kept safe, and also accessible to researchers, members of the public, and families, please consider donating to the MHS. And if you have papers that have family secrets, we'll keep them quiet for a few years if you need us to do that. We're pretty good. It is the support of friends like you that we can share programs like this and add to the collections. So, on with tonight's program. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be the person who introduces our speakers, but I think tonight, this truly might be a panel that needs no introduction. But I will go for it. Here we go. Lawrence DiCara is among Boston's most recognized civic leaders. He's a frequent speaker at colleges, universities, and other venues, as well as a go-to source in the Boston media. Larry has taught at Harvard, Boston University, and the University of Massachusetts. He has practiced real estate and administrative law and has been intimately involved with the development process in and around Boston for more than 40 years. James Pasto is a master lecturer at BU at Boston. He teaches seminars on dream theory, Boston's North End, and cultural anthropology. He is the co-founder of the North End Historical Society and editor of its journal. So now, I invite you all to sit back and enjoy the conversation as our panelists consider the influence of Italian culture on Boston's culture, economy, and politics. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Sometimes being a source quoted in the papers gets me in trouble. As Jim noted, the mayor just called me up. She wasn't happy about something which is running in the Globe about restaurants in the North End. So just it hits home sometimes. So at home in Jamaica Plain, I have a mirror over the table in the dining room. And there's a well-known quote from John Adams, whose papers are in the custody of this society. And it's well known. I must study politics and war that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy in order to give their children the right to study painting, poetry, and music. In a similar sense, our ancestors and the ancestors of some of the other people in this room could speak in a similar way and say, we shall be barbers and cobblers and work in sweatshops, making clothes for others so that our children can become teachers and nurses and bookkeepers, so that their children can become lawyers and doctors and investment bankers. That's the story of Italian people in Boston. In my case, my mother's side of the family came from the village of Annunciation, for those who don't speak Italian, outside the city of Messina, both before and after the great earthquake, the terremoto, the moving of the earth in 1908, which wiped out the city. And my father came with his mother and other members of her family from Catania in 1919. He came over at 13 months, which could not have been an easy trip in steerage in a boat. Both sides of the family did not live in the North End, but in the South End and Roxbury and Dorchester. there was a small but thriving Italian community. They became barbers. My grandfather, Lorenzo, after whom I was named, was a barber. They became cobblers. My other grandfather, who I never got to meet, was a cobbler. And they worked under unpleasant conditions so that their children could go to college. And they went to college, in the case of both of my parents, in the Depression. And all those stories about walking the mile to save the nickel for the bus, that was true. And it was not Italians from the North. I know somebody here has been to the North a lot. It's not people from Milan and Roma, Firenze, who came over because they had it pretty good. That's where people were well-dressed and educated, because Italy only came together as a country in 1860. Story told that my great-grandmother, my father's mother's mother, actually cut school to see Garibaldi going through the streets in Sicily, 1860. I used it in my senior paper at Boston Latin School, and Mr. Johnson said, "What's your source?" I said, "My grandmother." He said, "Okay." So, now, today, immigrants are working in hospitals. There is home health aides, as I've had plenty of in the last 3 years. They're the people who push the wheelchairs at the airports. They drive cabs. They work in restaurants. And the track is really very similar to the one that I described. So it really, in the book In Search of History, Theodore H. White suggests that the story of the American city is a story of a ballet. I quote that in the opening chapter of my book. And it is a ballet. One group follows the other. That's happened in the North End. It happened in the South End, in Dorchester, and in Roxbury. And these immigrants today are not only coming from Europe, where many of our ancestors came from, they're coming from all over the world. And not to get too political, those who suggest we should only welcome immigrants from Denmark or Norway are repeating the racist messages of a century ago that were aimed at us, okay? Because basically the restrictive immigration laws that the Ku Klux Klan and other groups fought for and succeeded in getting in the mid-20s were aimed at Southern and Eastern Europeans, mostly Italians and Jews. Now, my mother's family, we have a lot of research. My cousin Richard is here with his husband Simon. And there were 6 Alibrandis who came over. My grandfather was the oldest. His father came first, then he came next, and they brought them over. And of the 6 of them, 4 of them married someone not from Messina, from the same village, okay? From the same village, because we're clannish people. And when I was at Harvard, I took, I think it was Gov 109, Comparative Politics, and we read a book by Professor Banfield. And he did research, not in Sicily, but in the south of Italy, outside of Naples, Avellino, around there, about family structures. And he concluded, he called it amoral familism. He concluded that either you were family or you were a foreigner. In our household growing up, if you weren't Italian, you were a Medigani. Okay? Everybody who wasn't Italian was a Medigani, whether they were really Americans or not. And that research was done after World War II. And I've thought of that a lot because I grew up in a 2-decker, and my mother's parents lived on the first floor, the Alibrandis, from Messina. And my grandmother lived with us because her husband my dad's father had taken off back to the old country, never to be heard from again. And so they were together for years. And she could not understand why I had friends over at the house. I think I was 8 or 9 and had a birthday party. We're talking about, a cake and a few candles and maybe some Kool-Aid or Zarex or whatever we drank back then. We didn't drink soda a lot. And she couldn't understand it because they were stani. They were strangers. They weren't family. Couldn't understand. She had as much understanding of having Irish kids and Jewish kids who I went to school with and were my dear friends growing up and still are, as she didn't understand professional sports. I got to tell, it's in the book. There was a guy who played for the New York Giants named Andy Robustelli. He was a tight end. And I looked him up. He wore number 81. And she knew somebody back in Catania named Robustelli. So, hey, Robustelli, I can hear her just jabbering away. She had absolutely no idea what was going on the field. And she said, Robustelli è troppo vecchio per giovane football. He's too old to play football. I said, no. He's like 40 years younger than you are. How can you say that? 81, he's 81 years old. She thought his age was the numbers on his shirt. That's how clueless she was about American culture. So, there were Italians in a place other than the North End, which Jim has studied much more than I have preparing for this. They were in the South End, they were in Dorchester, they were in Roxbury, in Hyde Park and Rosendale. All those people moved south. When I was in politics in the 70s and 80s, there was an Italian society at Most Precious Blood in Hyde Park, one at Sacred Heart in Rosendale. In Brighton, there was a guy named Buggs, who was a contractor, brought over an entire village, the village of San Donato. And those families all ended up in construction, including Freddie Salvucci, our Secretary of Transportation. And they all intermarried. So the Magnarellis married the Ruffos, and the Ruffos married the Tempestas. They nearly all intermarried. And a lot of them are still in Brighton, and some of them are in Newton. And I'm told by a friend of mine in Florida that he suggested a friend of his whose last name is San Donato come here tonight, but she's not from San Donato. And to all of these people, wherever they were from, education was important, religion was important, upward mobility was important, and that's why they came here.
Well, you mentioned the mayor called you about the restaurants. I won't say anything more about that, but it reminds me of an essay I read by Frederick Bushy, who was a social worker who was walking through the North End. I believe it was in 1904. He published it in a magazine called The Arena. And it's called Italian Immigrants in Boston. And it's worth reading, looking up, because he's really describing the earliest community. But at one point he talks about the Italians eating this strange kind of food. It's very slippery, and they twist it on their forks, and they're very skilled, which, spaghetti, linguine, noodles, which was not a food that they knew about. And I think one of the contributions, obviously, of Italians to Boston in the United States is food. And it's interesting how some immigrants find niches, and the Italians found the food similar to Chinese immigrants, maybe Mexican immigrants today, and others don't find that. In 1934, in the 1930s, William Foote White was here, and he did his ethnography, Street Corner Society, and his wife lived with him, and she described that she was learning to make this new food that she'd never heard about, and it was pizza, right? And she was learning it from the Italian women in the North End. She's a Americana, yeah. And then in 1954-55, there's an article in the Boston Globe about this pizza now making its way out of the North End into the United States and competing with hot dogs at ballparks and so forth. But when I grew up in the North End, there weren't a lot of restaurants there. There were some places where you could buy pizza, you could get sandwiches. When I tell my students, we ate Italian food, but we didn't call it Italian food. It was just the food we ate. But there were restaurants there. There were some well-known restaurants, and then there were smaller family restaurants. usually for breakfast, for lunch, luncheonettes, and they were making the same food that they ate at home. Just a mother and a daughter would come down and cook in the restaurant. I'm getting to my family story, because my last name is Pasto, which means meal in Italian. And I didn't know that the name in Italy is pasta. My father used to always tell me a story that his father hated pasta. But he never told me our name was Pasta in Italy. And I only found out when I went to Italy to see the family, and the relatives on the side said, no, you've got to find the pastas, Domenico Pasta. So I think my father, he never told me, but I think the story was because my grandfather hated pasta, when he came here, he had the chance to change the name, and he changed it to Pasto. My father was a construction worker, and but he did open a bakery in East Boston for a short time. We lived in the North End, we grew up in the North End. So that's my, so they were from East Boston. My mother grew up in the North End. She lived here with her sisters, and her side. So my father's father came over, was talking to Larry about this 1904, my mother's father 1908. And then the women they married came over about 15 years later. It seemed that on my grandfather's side, there was an arranged marriage because they got married about 3 months later. My father's father went to Welch, West Virginia first. My father was born in Welch. And I don't know the details, but there were a lot of mines there. They were doing a lot of mining. So I think that's what drove them there. And maybe there was a lot of turmoil and so forth. So they ended up in Boston and East Boston. My mother's father is an interesting story that I found out later, that he was a sharecropper in Italy. He was in a town called Ariano Irpino. And the story is that the noble who owned the land basically seduced one of his sisters. And he was so insulted by that he left. He came to the United States. And later on, when the Italian government did some reforms, they gave some of the land to the family. He refused to take any of that land. And he never went back to Italy after that. I think, he just felt that he was insulted, and he didn't want to have a part of it. Just want to say, growing up in the North End, I always think of the North End as my village, as my Italian village. I mean, we really, especially in my generation, we were removed from Italy. Italy was the old country. We had distorted ideas. They still had outhouses as far as we were concerned. And we had bathrooms in the North End in the hallway, so we weren't that far up. But the North End became we didn't call it Little Italy, but it was really a very dense ethnic neighborhood. There was still a lot of immigrants coming over after the war. Probably about 30 or 40% of the kids I went to school with in elementary school in the 1960s were from Italy. So it was still very much that, and I still, again, that's if I'm in the diaspora, it's not the Italian diaspora, it's the North End diaspora, that we've moved out. So that's my story. Thank you.
The interesting thing that Jim mentioned about minors is that there are certain pockets of Italians in places you don't expect them. There are Italians in Vermont because they can do stones, okay? And they make great stones in Vermont, and there's Italians up there. I think we talked about this on the phone. When Ted Kennedy handled the Western states for his brother Jack in 1960, and the picture on the black and white TV is of Ted Kennedy standing with the Wyoming delegation. Wyoming gave Jack Kennedy enough votes, he made it in the first ballot. The key guy in Wyoming was named Tano Roncalio. He was from a mining family. Probably not a lot of Tano Roncalios left in Wyoming now, but they were a significant piece of the population. There's a wonderful man, maybe some of the older people may have remembered him, Gino Bellotti, who ran the Boston Foundation. His son Jeffrey worked for me at City Hall. Wonderful guy, extraordinarily successful president of Starwood Hotels and stuff. And Gino was from Wyoming. And they were Italian people recruited to work in the mines, and that's where he was raised. So there's a lot of stuff there that people don't think about. And of course, the other thing about, especially those of us Sicilians, you know, it's an island, a lot of fishing. You know, go to Catania, and you see the boats coming in, and the fish is for sale, and then you go to the restaurant and you say, I want a pound of that swordfish, and that's the way they eat, right? And it was good. But there were fishermen on the West Coast, too. There's a fellow named DiMaggio, whose father had a fishing boat out in San Francisco. And because fishermen go near where the ocean is. In the North End, the Sicilians were all on North Street. Why? Because it's where the ocean is. And that's where the headquarters is for the Fisherman's Feast, Madonna del Soccorso, which is a Sicilian feast. And you had these little villages within the village. And all the social clubs. I mean, Chris Iannello was my very dear friend. If you ever want to read about the North End almost 100 years ago, he is Chick Morelli in Street Corner Society. He was my colleague for 10 years. I've known the family for a long time. And he was endorsed when he ran for mayor in '67 by some club which was all people from Avellino. Why? Because he was from Avellino. And in East Boston, they had big battles, political battles, in the 30s and 40s between a mainland Italian and a Sicilian, both running for the legislature. There's a wonderful woman, Rosie Collintone, long deceased. She used to be Queen Isabella in the parades. Have you ever seen those? Ronaldo, you remember her, right? She used to be Queen Isabella in the parades. Her brother was the Sicilian candidate who ran for the legislature at that time. And it got really ugly between them. And my grandfather, Lorenzo, was a pretty serious guy. And my mother graduated from college, and he basically said, Concetta, you know, if a boy wants to take you to a movie, he comes to the house, he talks to me, you go to the movie, you'll be back by a certain time. He must be college educated, he must be Sicilian. Well, about 10 years later, she met my father, who qualified. He was college educated, he was Sicilian. So, and again, all legend, my mother played the piano, and the picture that, Richard, you sent me of our grandparents and my parents at Christmas together when I was in my mother's belly, because it was 1948, my father played the violin, my mother played the piano, and after they did this 4 or 5 times, my grandfather said, Salvatore, wouldn't it be good if you married Concetta? My father said, yeah, your daughter's really wonderful. Good, I'll call the relatives. And that was it, okay? He called the shots, because Lorenzo, he was the oldest, right? When you're the oldest, you call the shots. But he was a barber. He used to rent from Kazanoff's Bakery. So he was in a part of Roxbury that was Irish and Jewish and Italian. And years after he died, I found these programs from the Italian American Society of Roxbury. I didn't know there was an Italian Society of Roxbury. There wasn't one when I was running for office, I'll tell you that. And he was a vice president of the society, and they get a full-page ad from the Jewish guys, they get a full-page ad from the Irish guys. You know, they played both sides. And he had a barber shop, and back then people didn't have phones. So you found out things at the barber shop. Well, many, many years after he died, I had a barber, whose name was Renato, who was Calabrese. And if my grandfather ever knew that somebody from Calabria had a razor at my neck, okay, he'd be rolling over in his grave at St. Michael's.
Did you know Johnny Shoes, right? Johnny Camerata?
Yeah, Johnny Camerata, yeah.
I mean, he was a barber. He was my barber growing up, and
But they called him
Johnny
Shoes.
Shoes. His father was a cobbler. Yeah.
Cobblers and barbers, that's what we did.
And there really are so many barbershops in the North End,
Oh, yeah.
cobbler shops. But Johnny was always my connection. The mayor Mayor Menino went in to get his haircut, but I never knew what to expect when I went into Johnny's, who I was going to meet. And I remember one time I was taking my class on a tour through the North End, and Johnny was on Hanover Street. And we stopped to talk to Johnny. He was cutting somebody's hair, and he came out to talk to us, and he left the guy in the chair. And he's talking and talking, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The guy picked up the broom and started sweeping the barbershop. But that was, typical of him. He was a wonderful guy. And he was he was one of the community leaders, and there were so many community leaders who were just ordinary working people who, on sports teams. And I'm thinking, one in particular, one of the things I wanted to mention, there's the North End Health Center, a number of health centers through the community, but it was really started by a woman, Elaine Ioneko Wilson. But you know a little bit of the story about that, but basically, I don't know if it was the public health department came in, they were looking to get information about the health needs of the different communities, and they came into the North End, and Elaine and a number of other mothers did a survey of the needs, and they came back with results that amazed the people from the Mass General, the thoroughness of it, and the number of people they had interviewed. And to make the long story short, Elaine ended up becoming the CEO of this health center for many, many years.
Elaine and I share the same birthday, April 30. My birthday's coming up. And I was chairing the City Council Committee on Planning and Development in 1980. And we had a full council meeting on April 30th. And we put through Copley Place, which you're all aware of, and then we put through the North End Nursing Home. Except Freddie Langone didn't like the fact the nursing home was going to take places where him and his friends parked their cars. Except he went to the Bacaus or wherever, he wasn't in the room, and we put it through. That's why we have a nursing home in the North End.
And Elaine describes that effort. She was interviewed, I interviewed her, but she was interviewed by a woman called Beth Harrington, who made films about the North End. She made films about the Fisherman's Feast, and she did one about the Blinking Madonna. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're good films. But then she did her thesis, and it was called Women of Street Corner Society, and she interviewed about 4 or 5, maybe 6 women of the North End, and she told their stories. But Elaine describes the whole battle about the parking.
Oh, yeah.
And that was one of the things they really were upset about.
Yeah.
Because taking away was such a commodity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But I think my point there, too, about Elaine was she was an ordinary housewife.
Oh, yeah.
And so many of the ordinary people did extraordinary things, for the neighborhood. And even if it was just a baseball coach, for a young kid, it was extraordinary to have somebody there mentoring you and guiding you and so forth.
The North End had 40,000 people 100 years ago. It was as dense as Calcutta.
That's what they say.
And now has about 10,000, more or less. I mean, it depends where you draw the boundary around that. And when I ran the first time in 1971, so I tell people I was not 1871, 1971, and I knew there were 10,000 people in the North End, nearly all of whom would vote for me. And there were 40,000 people in East Boston, nearly all of whom would vote for me, because East Boston was also very heavily Italian. And I'd studied this. I did an early computer program. I'm really dating myself. We used punch cards, okay? That's a long time ago. Nats I 110, Professor Bossert. And I showed this. And sure enough, every precinct in the North End, Langone, Piemonte, Ionella, DiCara, every precinct in East Boston, Langone, Piemonte, Ionella, DiCara. I'll take it, okay? Because I didn't have a lot of friends in the North End in East Boston, because not a lot of them went to Latin school. Some did, but not a lot. One of them was Bobby DeLeo, later Speaker of the House. He was my classmate. He's from East Dean. But I had many more friends in the southern part of the city because I grew up in Dorchester, Lowell Mills, and the kids I went to Latin school with were Hyde Park, Rosie, West Roxbury, Jamaica Plain. So I had a lot of good contacts there. Yeah, I studied it, and exactly as I predicted, I came in really well in wards 1, 3, East Boston, North End, 16 and 17 in the southern part of Dorchester, where I grew up, and 4 and 5 in the Back Bay, Beacon Hill, South End, where there were people who had college educations. We didn't have as many of them as we do in Boston now. That's where I got the bulk of my votes, and I held on the rest of the places. And as the city has changed, I've seen the demographics change dramatically. There was a precinct in Jamaica Plain, first time I ran, that I came in 15th out of 18. I beat the 2 black guys running and a socialist. So I didn't have a lot of strength. It had basically been abandoned because they thought the highway was going to go through. Remember the highway, which a lot of us worked hard to stop. And 8 years later, when it had been repopulated by college-educated people, I was coming in like second and third in those precincts. All happened in the course of 8 years. So it's that ballet of which we speak. And, you know, Italian people, just as they found their way from the North End north to East Boston, Revere, all those kinds of places to the north, you can go all the way up Saugus and all those places. It's full of Italian people. And the same with the ribbons of Italians that found their way to the southern part of the city, and significant Italian populations in a lot of the burbs which are in that general direction. There's Italians in Norwood, there are Italians in Dedham. Never the majority, but always a significant piece of the population. I think it's perhaps sadness, since I thought I'd be the first Italian mayor, but so did Piemonte and so did Iannella. And Menino ended up being the first Italian mayor, but Menino, like me, was not from a majority Italian community. Reedville has 2 sides. One side which is more Italian than anything else. The other side is more Irish than anybody else. A little different now than it was back then. But Tommy grew up, you know, going to school and playing sports with people who weren't Italian, just like I did. And that meant that when he ran for mayor against an Irish guy, Brett, he cleaned his clock. It was like 60-40. He beat him in West Roxbury, which is a heavily Irish neighborhood, especially back then. But Tommy, so far anyway, the only Italian mayor we've had, was not from the core of the North End, as was Piemonte and Iannella, and Langone also ran sort of, I think somebody put him in '83, but I can't prove that. Questions out there, folks? In the back, yeah.
Yes, good evening. Is there a history during World War II of the prisoners of war from Italy who I think were brought over to Boston? And what was the relationship between the Italian community and them? Or was there any?
The way I heard it growing up, they had a prisoner of war camp at Columbia Point, right where UMass is now. You heard this too?
But also Columbus High School, Columbus School in the North End.
Well, okay, that I didn't know. But they would let Italians from Boston come in on like a Sunday and bring them like salami and pasta and things like that. We have Mary Alibrandi married Tony Stegagno. He was from Italy. And I think he was a prisoner of war, but I don't know if Tony was a prisoner of war at Columbia Point. Tony actually, he worked for a company named Falzerano. And when I was on the city council, I led the floor fight for the restoration of Quincy Market, which was a very tough vote at the time because the people had their businesses there. And part of the agreement with the roast company was that the city pay to have the bricks secured on the two outside buildings, the north and the south. Uncle Tony worked on that because we do bricks, okay? Like we do granite, like we mine. We learned those skills in the old country.
And that's, if I can just follow up briefly, I've been contacted a number of times, people trying to find information about this, and they've done a little research I have, and there seems to be no documentary trace at all of this, just stories.
The stories.
Thank you.
Is it on? Yes. Thank you. Like Jim, I'm from the North End. I was born and raised there. And I add this because of my question, or just to ask you to share some observations about something which when I was a child, being a woman there, or a girl, we didn't talk about, although my grandfather was a tavern keeper and certainly had a front row, which is the influence really of crime, like illegal activity, and how much that figured in community relations. I swear that I did not know my grandfather even had a bookie. I mean, I just thought this guy was always in the bar. They were always playing cards. We were just playing with the cigarette machines, just having fun.
I think that to some extent, organized crime, or as a friend of mine who's a prosecutor calls it unorganized crime, sort of probably helped to keep the neighborhood intact, certainly made it a safe place for women. When Kevin was mayor, a lot of the women who worked for him started living in the North End because they could walk to City Hall and because they were safe, because people kept an eye out for you. First time I ran, I figured out that there was a higher percentage of Boston people at the feasts on the Sunday nights because the Americani were gone by then. And so I'd campaign on Sunday nights. And I'm handing out my leaflets, 22 years old, very idealistic. Hey kid, go up the club, talk to the boys. So I walked this creepy stairs to the club. Everybody's smoking a cigar. Everybody's drinking good vino rosso. Piles of cash and cards. I mean, we're not talking quarters here, folks. We're talking greenbacks, okay? Hey kid, go say hello to Jerry. I said, hi, I'm Larry DiCara. I said, hey kid, Jerry Angiulo, good luck. He was the head of organized crime in the North End. And I said, nice to meet you, Mr. Angiulo. I turned around, and the thought in my mind was, if anybody takes a picture, my political career is over before it starts, okay? I physically ran out and down the stairs. I get home, second floor of Codman Hill. Remember we had the two bookcases, Richard? There's a bookcase on either side, separating the dining room and the gumwood, separating the dining room and the living room. I told my parents that I shook Gennaro Angiulo's hand. And my father said, oh, son. And whenever he said son, it was important. Son, he and I were classmates at English High School. And he takes out the yearbook, and it had been probably there since we moved into the house in '56, so it's 15 years of dust. I can close my eyes. He blows the dust off the yearbook, opens it to the A's, Gennaro Angiulo from the Elliott School, or whichever school was in the North End. Good luck, Sal, your friend Jerry. So the Italian kids all knew each other. And he said, son, look at his ambition. He made it halfway. And I looked in the yearbook. His ambition was to be a criminal lawyer. So he made it halfway. That's the closest I ever came. My Harvard classmate, George Schreiner, who I'm not exactly sure what his heritage is, he's not Italian, tall, skinny, blonde guy, was a doctor at MGH. And he would he'd give free advice to the ladies in the neighborhood. He had that little teeny house on Hull Street, the Spite House that's like 9 feet wide. He had that house. And he would let the tell ladies, oh, don't listen to that doctor. You can eat pasta. Don't listen, you can have, the eggplant parm, So he was a favorite of the old ladies in the neighborhood. His car got broken into. So he goes to Mrs. Bacigalupo and says, Mrs. Bacigalupo, my car got broken into. Dr. George, this will never happen again. Come with me. Goes to a laundromat. I think it was one of the Lamones. And this is Dr. George. He's good to all the old ladies in the North End. This is what his car is. Be sure his car, don't worry, Mrs. Bacigalupo, his car was never messed with again. So there were unwritten rules. I always was well treated by everybody. Nobody ever asked me to do anything wrong.
And, with the numbers, it was such a part of the local economy all over the United States before the lotteries. I can remember going into a store, a little grocery store, and my mother would tell me, okay, get a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, and tell them $3.42, quarter and $3.42, the number. And the local vendors would do that. But it contributed to the safety of the North End, and also, again, the local economy. The money stayed within the neighborhood.
And it probably helped some of the stores stay in business.
Helped them stay in business, yes.
Yeah.
And those, the bookies also, they had more money, and they would loan money out to people. So when people didn't have credit that they could go to banks, that they could go to local people and get loans. And of course, that could get you into trouble, but, if you were gambling and so forth. But many people didn't. They went for legitimate reasons, and it was very helpful to them to start businesses.
I was the acting mayor during the blizzard of '78. I think most people here would remember that. And it was before ATMs. So we ran out of cash in the city. And the North End was one of the neighborhoods where everybody took care of everybody else. And we'll see you when you get your next check and you go to the bank again. So you had these unwritten rules, and because it was so dense and everybody knew everybody else, you had to keep your word.
Yes.
And if you didn't keep your word, bastonati or something, it would be bad.
Yeah.
Nuke?
Wondering if you could talk a little bit about the political rivalry between the Irish and the Italians in particular, because that's a big theme in the history of Boston in the last 75 years.
Unfortunately, I have an appointment in the morning. I could lecture from now until the sun comes up about that. It's really, I'm sorry if I'm talking too
please
much,
go.
because I lived it, okay? And I ran for mayor of Boston in 1983, 2 Harvard degrees, lawyer, all that kind of stuff. And intelligent people would tell me to my face, in 1983, no Italian will ever be elected mayor of Boston. Not bigots. We're not talking the Ku Klux Klan. We're not talking guys on the longshore, down the longshoreman. We're talking about intelligent people. And I think part of it was that for the Irish, politics was much more of a road of upward mobility than it was to the Italians and to other groups. Because they spoke English, it was easier for them than it was for people who came over from Italy who did not speak English as their first language. And I give credit to Chris Iannella. He came over when he was 8 years old, spoke perfect English, born in 1913, came over in 1921, 1936 graduated from Boston College. Tip O'Neill was his classmate. 1940, he and Mario Yamato, the first Italians to ever graduate from Harvard Law School, 1940. All happened within 20 years. And his English was perfect. And
Just to follow up, historically, the Street Corner Society is really, I recommend it. Chapter 4, he talks a lot about the numbers and the organized crime and how that worked. But Chapter 6 is a great discussion of early political rally and the competition between the Italians and the Irish. So it's
Very significant, and once the Irish, and I apologize if this sounds bad towards people who are Irish, once the Irish had political power, they didn't really want to give it up. And that's because it was a battle to get it, okay? With all due respect to some of the people who may have helped to construct this building, the old families didn't necessarily welcome the Irish to Boston. And there were enormous barriers. No Irish need apply, all that kind of stuff. That was for real. And so once they had the power, they would place the people in the utilities, the Edison Company, the gas company, the telephone company. They would use their political offices to get their own people in there. If you were a rep or a senator or a councilor from South Boston, you'd get people into Gillette. By the time Mama became a school teacher in 1937, most of the old Yankee school marms, mostly unmarried ladies, most of them were gone. There were still a few left. I had Miss Glover from Vermont, was my kindergarten teacher, and she taught us how to make butter. I'll never forget that. So, Miss Glover was still around, but most of the teachers were Irish, as was the entire school committee. A couple of exceptions. For the most part, for the first 75 years of the 20th century, basically everybody in the school committee was Irish. And that's who got the jobs. When Mama became a teacher in 1937, she was the 7th Italian teacher in the city of Boston, in a school system of about 130,000 pupils. 7th. And Famiglietti, who was my Glee Club instructor, and Leonard Bernstein's Glee Club instructor at Latin School, Joe Trongone, Fortunato Sordillo, 4 of them were music teachers, 4 out of 7. Because, Italians, they do music. Just like the guy gave the dance lessons back in almost 200 years ago. And interestingly enough, when Mama got married in 1948, the law was a married woman could not teach. She had to resign the day she got married. And the man who took her place as a music teacher was Rollins Griffith, who was a black man. Later, the assistant superintendent of schools. Wonderful man. I met him on many, many occasions. Because, black people, they can sing, okay? And it was the same basic patterns. It was just assumed that it was okay to have an Italian as a music teacher or a black as a music teacher because that's music, as opposed to math or science. I can't prove that, if I still work, okay, I'm very happy I work. If I had nothing else to do, I suppose I could get the archives of the school department in 37 and look down the list of the school teachers and see if Mama's recollection was correct. Mama's mind was crisp till the day she died at 91. She didn't forget stuff. Sometimes it got me in trouble, but that's a whole other story. So I think she was correct.
Larry?
Yeah.
First, a comment on Irish wanting government and power to get jobs. When Bill Bulger was Senate President for 17 years, they called the MBTA Mr. Bulger's Transit Authority because he could get as many jobs as he wanted there. The question is, you expected Italians to vote for you and Piemonte and others 50 years ago. If you were running now, would you expect them to vote for you in the same way? And further on that, do your children identify with Italian heritage the same way you do and as strongly?
My children are half Irish, half Italian. I'm neither complaining nor bragging. I was telling, I think it was Jim or somebody else was telling, I've been lucky. My kids have done fine, And they have Italian names, My daughter Sophie is Sofia Concetta DiCara. That's an Italian name. She's whiter than this piece of paper. She puts on SPF 100 when she leaves the house in the morning. So she has Irish skin. And my other daughter is Flora DiCara, and the third is Catherine, not named after Aunt Catherine, named after her other grandmother. I think they know they have Italian names. I had Flora apply for a scholarship from the Sons of Italy, and she got a $1,000 check. But we had to go to the breakfast, which was in Andover, and we had to pay for the tickets, which was okay. And she was very upset with the speakers. And I said, keep your mouth shut. They gave you a check for $1,000. So, but they don't really identify. The one who has a boyfriend, I think the kid's Irish. I haven't asked. If I were running again, which I'm not going to, I would get some votes in the North End, but I'd probably get as many votes from the Americani in the North End as I would from the Italians. I'd get some votes in the Heights in East Boston. I'd still get my little pockets in Reedville and stuff like that, but not the numbers that I counted on successfully in the 70s. It's a very, very different city, and I think identity politics, which I happen to think may be the destroyer of the Democratic Party as we know it, but that's a different lecture. Identity politics means different things to different people, but I think folks who've been here 100, 120 years do not identify like newcomers. Does that make any sense, Jimmy?
I would add one thing briefly. So Larry and I, talking about us as Italians, we mean Italian Americans, although I always said Italian, but Italians who come here now from Italy oftentimes look at us and say, how are you Italian? Right? And they don't understand the communities. We grew up in, and even if you weren't in a majority Italian American community, there were others Italians around you, and it was important for politics. Certain position, you needed to work together as a group. So that's disappeared. But I think what's going to be happening is these new Italians who are coming in might be forming a new kind of Italian identity, Italian American ethnicity, which one of the things they build it on, which we lost, and we speak a little dialect, but
Yeah.
I don't, but they want to keep the Italian language. And that's why sometimes they say, well, how are you Italian? You don't speak Italian language.
I write about this extensively in my book. I went to school in 1954, and the school called up my mother, who was a school teacher, and said, please come to the school. We have to talk to you about Lawrence. I only found this out when I'm in my 30s. Lawrence has a speech impediment. My mother said, a speech impediment? We don't think he has a speech impediment. Oh yes, sometimes strange words come out of his mouth. And is he exposed to any foreign language? And she said, yeah, his grandmother lives with us and she doesn't speak English and sometimes he talks to her in Italian. Well, he shouldn't. So basically, my colloquial Sicilian dialect was kicked out of me when I was 5 years old. Now, you think of it, and I've taught modern American political history. Joe McCarthy was riding high, right? Mussolini's still hanging from the tree, for all we know. So it was not an easy time to be showing up at school speaking Italian. And they put me in a remedial speech class for a year and a half. I think I turned out okay. But that's what they did to people who spoke a foreign language. Now, we tend to glorify it. Right. I mean, I did my undergraduate thesis on bilingual education in the Boston Public Schools. And I think we've done as poor a job in the last 50 years as we did prior to that time. But now we encourage people to be bilingual. I wish I was bilingual. I mean, I've been to Italy a couple of times, and, I can say, prego un bicchiere di acqua, please give me a glass of water, because a 4 or 5-year-old knows that, I know the numbers, okay? I know the months, I know the days of the week, but good luck saying, how do I find my way to Boylston Street? Because kids don't know those kinds of things.
So our last question comes from online. Marianne is asking what the experience was like and if there was anti-Italian feeling during World War II.
Well, I was not alive during World War II. You weren't either, Jim. I think it was tough for Italian people. On the other hand, the records show like 1 million or 1,100,000 Italians fought in the American Army, in many cases landing on the coasts of Sicily and on Anzio. They had some horrible battles because at that point, the Nazis had basically pushed the Italian army out of the way. The Italian army was not that successful. And the Nazis were brutal, okay? And they was tough. And guys came back from the war talking about how brutal it was to be, there were 60,000 Nazi soldiers in Sicily, and the Americans pushed them out, and they crossed the Straits of Messina, just as all my people did for all the centuries before. I think it had to be difficult. Joe DiMaggio's father, we all know what happened to the Japanese on the West Coast, right? They were interned. But there were rules against Italians, which I didn't know about until recently. And there was a rule that an Italian could not own a radio because they were convinced that there would be messages coming through in the radio. And Joe DiMaggio's father's neighbors, who were not Italians, bought him a radio and said, that's our radio, you can listen to it, so you can listen to the boys playing baseball. So there was a lot of discrimination, not as abject as against the Japanese. The discrimination against Germans, I think, was far more significant in World War I because we had a lot of German communities in the United States which taught German in school. There was German bilingualism in Nebraska and the Dakotas and states like that. And all of that got kicked out as soon as we declared war in 1917.
I just mentioned very briefly, there's a film called Potentially Dangerous that is about, it documents a lot of the anti-Italian, and I think it was very regional, depended where you were from.
Everybody, that's our signal, and
Yeah.
I want to say thank you so much for a wonderful program, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know about you, but I'm having pasta for dinner. I can't go with your grandfather. I just got to do it. We have more terrific events coming up, folks, including seminars, a K-12 teacher open house, and more conversations. So please keep your eye on your email for more information about upcoming programs. Visit the website, masshist.org. And if you're not on our mailing list, you should be. So please sign up for email. Thank you again. Just join with me to thank our friends.